They told you Henry VIII desperately wanted a son, that he tore England apart trying to secure a male heir. But what if he actually got one and never knew it? What if the greatest monarch England ever had wasn't his daughter at all, but a village boy who replaced her after a death Henry was never told about? In 1544, something happened at a remote manor that changed history forever, and the evidence they found buried beneath that same manor 300 years later explains why Elizabeth I's tomb has remained sealed for over 400 years. Picture this: summer of 1544, and somewhere in the green countryside of Gloucestershire in a place called Bisley, the most dangerous secret in England is about to be born. A 10-year-old girl lies dying in Overcourt House, far from the plague-ridden streets of London where she'd been sent for safety. This isn't just any child. This is Princess Elizabeth, daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, third in line to the English throne. The plague they'd been running from hadn't followed them to Bisley, but death had found her anyway. An unknown fever, sudden and vicious, had taken hold of the young princess and wouldn't let go. Her governess, Catherine Ashley, watched in horror as the child's condition worsened by the hour. Within days, maybe even hours, Princess Elizabeth stopped breathing. The girl who would never become queen was dead at 10 years old. Or at least then that's what should have happened. The servants who witnessed her final moments knew they were staring at their own deaths as much as hers. The moment Elizabeth's small body went still, Catherine Ashley faced a problem that made death itself seem merciful. She was responsible for keeping the king's daughter alive. That was her one job, the single task that defined her entire existence at that moment. And she had failed. But this wasn't a failure you could apologize for. Wasn't a mistake you could explain away with excuses about fever and bad luck and the will of God. This was Henry VIII's daughter lying dead, and Henry VIII didn't accept excuses. This was the same king who had ordered his own wife, Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth's mother, dragged to the executioner's block on Tower Green. The same king who had watched 5 other wives come and go, 2 of them losing their heads to his paranoia and rage. The same king who had ripped England away from the Catholic Church because the Pope wouldn't give him what he wanted. This was a man who had demonstrated repeatedly and brutally that he would destroy anyone who disappointed him, regardless of their station or their excuses. Catherine Ashley knew exactly what happened to people who failed Henry VIII. They died screaming. The Tower of London had cells waiting for people exactly like her. People who had let royal children slip through their fingers into death's embrace. She could already feel the rope around her neck, could imagine the jeering crowds that would gather to watch her execution. The servants at Overcourt House moved through the rooms like ghosts, speaking in whispers, afraid that somehow the king would hear them even from London, miles and miles away. They had hours, maybe a day at most, before someone from court would arrive, asking to see the princess. Before Henry himself might decide to visit his daughter and check on her health. Every moment that passed without a solution brought them closer to discovery, closer to the tower, closer to the executioner sharpening his blade. Catherine Ashley gathered the most trusted servants, the ones who had been present when Elizabeth died, and told them the truth in words that must have felt like poison on her tongue. The princess is dead, and if the king discovers this, we all die with her. Not just Catherine. Every single person in that house who had been responsible for Elizabeth's care would be held accountable. Their families would be destroyed. Their names would be cursed. Their property would be seized by the crown. Their children would grow up carrying the shame of treason. But what could they do? You can't hide a royal death. You can't pretend a princess is still alive when her body lies cold in an upstairs room. The smell of death would fill the house within hours. Rigor mortis would set in, making the body unmovable. Someone would have to prepare the corpse for burial, and you can't bury a princess in secret. Or can you? Here's where desperation turns into something darker, something that would change English history forever. Someone in that room, and history hasn't recorded who, suggested the impossible. What if they didn't tell the king? What if they found a way to make him believe Elizabeth was still alive? The idea was insane. It was treason of the highest order. It meant deceiving the King of England himself, lying to his face about the survival of his own daughter. Discovery would mean torture followed by execution, and not the quick kind. They'd be hanged, drawn, and quartered, their bodies put on display as a warning to anyone else who thought about betraying their monarch. The punishment for deceiving the king about royal succession was specifically designed to be as horrific as possible. First hanged until nearly dead, then cut down while still conscious. Then disemboweled, forced to watch as your own intestines were burned before your eyes. Then beheaded. Then your body cut into quarters and sent to different parts of the kingdom as a warning. That was the fate awaiting anyone caught in this deception. But staying silent meant the same fate. just arriving a day or two later when someone discovered the dead princess. They were trapped between two versions of certain death, and at least one version offered a chance, however slim, of survival. The plan that emerged from that desperate meeting was simple in concept, but terrifyingly complex in execution. They would replace Elizabeth. They would find someone who looked enough like the princess to fool the king's representatives. Someone who could be dressed in her clothes and taught to mimic her mannerisms and presented as the recovered patient when officials came calling. It bought them time, they told themselves. Just enough time to figure out what to do next. To maybe find a way to break the news gently, to somehow survive this catastrophe. But there was one massive, seemingly insurmountable problem with this plan. They needed a girl who looked like Princess Elizabeth. And there weren't any. Bisley was a small village, isolated and remote, tucked away in the Gloucestershire countryside, far from major roads and cities. Everyone knew everyone else. Every family had been counted, every child accounted for. The servants searched desperately through their mental catalogues of village children. Red gold hair like Elizabeth's was rare enough. Pale skin, delicate features, the right build, the right age. All of these things needed to align perfectly. They couldn't just grab any random child and hope for the best. The deception had to be convincing enough to fool trained observers who had seen Elizabeth before, who knew what the king's daughter looked like. And there were no girls in Bisley who fit. They went through every possibility, every family with daughters the right age, and none of them would work. Too dark-haired, too tall. Too obviously different from the princess everyone had seen arriving in Bisley just weeks earlier. The clock was ticking. Elizabeth's body couldn't be kept in that upstairs room much longer without people asking questions. The summer heat would accelerate decomposition, making the situation even more desperate. They needed a solution immediately, and the solution they needed didn't exist. Except it did exist, just not in the form they expected. Then someone said the words that would echo through 400 years of history and conspiracy theories. "There's a boy." The room went silent. A boy? How could a boy possibly replace Princess Elizabeth? But as the speaker continued, explaining what they meant, the others began to understand. There was a boy in the village who looked remarkably like the dead princess. Same coloring, same build, same delicate features, young enough that the differences between boys and girls weren't yet pronounced. Old enough to be trained, to be taught, to be made to understand that his survival and everyone else's depended on him playing this role perfectly. His name, according to legend, was John Neville, though some versions of the story call him simply the Bisley Boy because his real identity has been lost to time and deliberate obscurity. He lived in the village with his family, unremarkable except for one crucial detail. He looked extraordinarily like the dead princess. The same red gold hair so distinctive that it marked both Henry VIII and his daughter Elizabeth. The same pale, almost translucent skin that characterized the Tudor line. The same slight build, the same facial structure, the same general appearance that from a distance or in formal settings could pass for Elizabeth herself. At 10 years old, boys and girls aren't that different physically. They haven't hit puberty yet. Their bodies haven't developed the obvious characteristics that make gender unmistakable. With the right clothes, the right training, the right presentation, a boy could absolutely pass for a girl, especially a royal girl who everyone approached with carefully maintained distance and formal respect. The more Catherine Ashley thought about it, the more possible it seemed. Not easy, not safe, but possible. And possibility was all they had. The servants moved quickly because they had no choice. They went to John Neville's family in the dead of night and made them an offer they couldn't refuse. Actually, it wasn't an offer at all. It was an order backed by the threat of execution for everyone in Bisley if they didn't comply. "Your son looks like the princess. The princess is dead. Your son will take her place or we all hang for treason." The family was terrified, but what could they do? Say no and watch their son grow up in a village where everyone knew his family had condemned them all to death? Say no and face the king's wrath when the deception was discovered anyway? They had no choice. Just like Catherine Ashley had no choice, just like everyone in that cursed house had no choice. So they handed over their son. A boy of 10 years old was taken from his family in the middle of the night and brought to Overcourt House where a dead princess waited to be replaced. History doesn't record what John Neville thought about any of this. Whether he was terrified or excited or simply numb with shock. Whether he understood what was being asked of him or thought this was some temporary game that would end soon. He was 10. He was a village boy who probably couldn't read or write. And suddenly he was being told he had to become Princess Elizabeth. The transformation began immediately. They stripped the dead princess and dressed her in a simple servant's gown. They took her body in the darkness before dawn and buried it somewhere in the grounds of Overcourt House, deep enough that no one would accidentally discover it, unmarked so that no one would know what lay beneath the earth. Then they took John Neville and began turning him into Elizabeth Tudor. First, the obvious things. They put him in her clothes, the elaborate gowns that princesses wore, layer upon layer of fabric and undergarments. They had to teach him how to move in these clothes, how to walk without tripping over skirts, how to sit properly, how to stand with the posture expected of royalty. They worked with him on his voice, teaching him to speak in a higher register, to use the formal language Elizabeth would have used, to adopt the accent and speech patterns of the royal court rather than a Gloucestershire village. They taught him Elizabeth's history, everything she would know about her own life. Her mother's execution when Elizabeth was not even 3 years old, her father's subsequent marriages, her half-brother Edward, her half-sister Mary, the tutors she'd studied with, the books she'd read, the prayers she would know, everything that made Elizabeth who she was, John Neville had to learn and internalize and make part of himself. But here's what made the situation even more desperate and even more possible at the same time. Princess Elizabeth, at 10 years old, hadn't been at court much. Her mother's execution had made her somewhat of an embarrassment to Henry VIII. She'd been declared illegitimate, removed from the line of succession, shuttled between various country estates with minimal contact with her father or the center of royal power. Most of the court had never seen her up close. Many had never seen her at all. The king himself barely knew his own daughter. This wasn't unusual for Tudor royalty. Kings didn't raise their own children. They didn't spend time with them, didn't develop close relationships with them. Children were political tools, marriage pawns, potential heirs. Henry had 3 legitimate children and treated all of them with distant formality. He'd see Elizabeth occasionally at formal events, where she would be presented to him with all the appropriate ceremony. She would curtsy, he would nod. Maybe they'd exchange a few words, then she'd be dismissed. That was the extent of their relationship. So when John Neville, dressed as Elizabeth, had to face the king for the first time, he wasn't facing a father who knew his daughter's every mannerism and would spot an impostor instantly. He was facing a distant authority figure who expected formal obedience and wouldn't look too closely at the child presenting it. The first test came sooner than anyone wanted. Within days of Elizabeth's death and John's transformation, a representative from the king's court arrived at Bisley to check on the princess's health. Henry had heard reports that she'd been ill, and while he wasn't concerned enough to come himself, he wanted confirmation that his daughter was recovering properly. This was it. The moment where everything would either work or catastrophically fail. Catherine Ashley prepared John Neville as thoroughly as possible in the limited time they had. She coached him on exactly what to say, how to behave, what posture to adopt. She dressed him in Elizabeth's finest gown, arranged his red gold hair in the style Elizabeth wore, and positioned him in the great hall where the representative would be brought to see him. When the man from court entered, John Neville stood and curtsied exactly as he'd been taught. He spoke the formal greeting he'd memorized. He answered questions about his health with carefully prepared responses, and the representative from the king's court saw exactly what he expected to see. A young princess recovering from illness, properly respectful, appropriately royal. He never suspected anything was wrong. Why would he? The idea that someone would dare to replace a royal child was so outrageous, so impossibly dangerous, that it wouldn't even occur to him as a possibility. The representative left satisfied, and the household at Overcourt House breathed a collective sigh of relief that must have felt like the first real breath they'd taken in days. It had worked. The impossible deception had actually worked. But that moment of relief immediately transformed into a new terror, because now they couldn't stop. The deception that was supposed to be temporary, just buying them a few days to figure out what to do, had become permanent. They couldn't suddenly announce that Elizabeth had died days ago and they'd been lying about it. That would mean execution for everyone involved. They couldn't produce the real Elizabeth because she was buried in the ground. They couldn't send John Neville back to his family because too many people had seen Elizabeth alive and well. The boy from Bisley was trapped in the identity of Princess Elizabeth Tudor, and there was no way out. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. And John Neville learned to become Elizabeth so thoroughly that the village boy disappeared entirely, replaced by the princess he was pretending to be. The servants who knew the truth were bound together by their shared guilt and terror. They couldn't tell anyone. They couldn't confess. They couldn't even hint at what had really happened. So they stayed silent, and the secret stayed buried, and John Neville kept playing his role. But what nobody at Bisley understood in 1544 was that this temporary deception wouldn't just last months. It would last decades. It would last until 1603, when the person everyone knew as Elizabeth I would die at 70 years old, having ruled England for 44 years. The boy from Bisley, if the legend is true, would go on to become the greatest monarch England ever had. But none of that had happened yet. In 1544, they were still just trying to survive day by day, hoping the king wouldn't notice, hoping no one would look too closely. And here's the truly remarkable part. Henry VIII never suspected a thing. Not then, not ever. He would die in 1547, just 3 years after the alleged switch, still believing Elizabeth was his daughter, never knowing that the child he'd fathered had died in a remote country house and been replaced by a village boy who learned to wear her identity like a costume. The impossible problem that Catherine Ashley and her fellow servants faced in the summer of 1544 wasn't just hiding a death. It was maintaining a lie that grew more complex and more dangerous with every passing day. Every time someone from court visited, every time correspondence arrived asking about Elizabeth's health or education, every time the king sent gifts or instructions, the deception had to be perfect. One mistake, one slip. One moment where John Neville forgot his training and acted like the village boy he really was, instead of the princess he was pretending to be, and everything would collapse. The punishment for treason against the crown wasn't just execution. It was public torture designed to make an example, to ensure that everyone in England understood what happened to people who dared to deceive their king. Catherine Ashley would have been the first to die, probably. As the person directly responsible for Elizabeth's care, she would bear the primary blame. They would have questioned her extensively, using methods that made confession inevitable. She would have given up the names of everyone else involved, and then they all would have died. One by one, their executions turned into public spectacles. But somehow, impossibly, the secret held. The servants at Overcourt House kept their mouths shut. John Neville's family stayed silent, knowing their son's life and their own depended on it. The boy himself learned his role so thoroughly that he stopped thinking of himself as John Neville at all. He became Elizabeth, not just in appearance and mannerisms, but in his own mind. This wasn't just an act he was performing. It was a complete transformation of identity. He studied the things Elizabeth would have studied. He read the books she would have read. He learned Latin and Greek and French. He practiced needlework and dancing and all the accomplishments expected of a Tudor princess. He absorbed Elizabeth's history so completely that it became his own history. He memorized her memories, or at least the memories she would have had. And gradually, over months and years, the distinction between John Neville and Elizabeth Tudor blurred and eventually disappeared. The performance became reality. The mask became the face. The village boy was gone, replaced entirely by the princess he'd been forced to impersonate. Now here's where the story takes on an even darker dimension. Because if this switch really happened, then John Neville didn't just have to fool the king's representatives during childhood. He had to maintain the deception through puberty, through adulthood, through situations that would make the truth increasingly difficult to hide. A 10-year-old boy can pass as a 10-year-old girl relatively easily. Their bodies haven't developed the obvious characteristics that make gender unmistakable. But what happens when that boy hits puberty? What happens when his body starts changing in ways that should be impossible for Elizabeth Tudor? This is where the Bisley Boy theory intersects with the medical evidence that's been puzzling historians for centuries. Because the person who became Elizabeth I displayed numerous characteristics that contemporary observers found deeply confusing and that modern medical researchers have struggled to explain. Henry VIII returned to something resembling normal life after being assured his daughter was recovering well at Bisley. He had other concerns, other problems demanding his attention. England's relationship with France was deteriorating. His own health was failing, his leg wound from a jousting accident years earlier refusing to heal, and causing him constant pain. His son Edward, the heir he'd torn England apart to produce, was a sickly child who might not survive to adulthood. Elizabeth was third in line for the throne, behind Edward and Mary, and Henry probably didn't expect she'd ever rule. She was useful primarily as a potential marriage pawn, someone who could be wedded to a foreign prince to cement an alliance. But that was years away. For now, she was just a child recovering from illness in the countryside, and Henry had more pressing matters to deal with. He never visited Bisley himself during Elizabeth's stay there. He never demanded to see his daughter in person. He never looked closely enough to notice anything wrong. And when Elizabeth eventually returned to court, she was presented in formal settings where distance and ceremony protected the deception. The person everyone now knew as Elizabeth Tudor moved through the next few years with careful precision, always maintaining the role, never slipping, never making mistakes. The household staff who knew the truth gradually scattered as time passed. Some died of natural causes. Others were quietly paid off and sent to distant estates where they couldn't talk. New servants who joined Elizabeth's household had no idea anything was unusual. They simply served who they believed to be the king's daughter. Catherine Ashley remained as Elizabeth's governess and closest confidant, the one person who absolutely knew the truth and carried that knowledge like a stone around her neck for the rest of her life. She would serve Elizabeth faithfully until her death in 1565, taking the secret to her grave. No deathbed confession, no moment of weakness where she revealed what had really happened that summer in Bisley. She stayed silent, and the deception continued. In January 1547, Henry VIII died. He was 55 years old, massively overweight, suffering from numerous ailments that his physicians couldn't treat. His death had been expected for months, and when it finally came, the transition of power happened smoothly. Edward, Henry's 9-year-old son, became Edward VI. Mary and Elizabeth remained in line behind him. If the Bisley Boy theory is true, then Henry VIII went to his grave never knowing what had happened to his real daughter, never suspecting that the child he thought was Elizabeth was actually a village boy who'd been playing a role for 3 years, never understanding that his desperate desire for male heirs had been ironically fulfilled in the worst possible way, with a boy secretly taking his daughter's place. The king who had obsessed over succession, who had broken with Rome and married 6 times trying to secure male heirs, who had torn England apart over questions of legitimate children, died completely ignorant of the greatest deception ever perpetrated against the English crown. Edward VI's reign lasted only 6 years. He died in 1553 at 15 years old, probably from tuberculosis, and the succession crisis everyone had feared for decades finally arrived. Edward had tried to divert the throne to Lady Jane Grey, cutting both Mary and Elizabeth out of the succession. But Mary, Henry's oldest surviving child, had support from Catholics throughout England who saw her as the rightful heir. She claimed the throne by force, executing Lady Jane Grey and anyone else who stood in her way. Elizabeth, still playing the role of dutiful younger sister, stayed quiet and careful during this dangerous period. Mary was paranoid, suspicious, and perfectly willing to execute potential threats. Elizabeth had to walk a careful line between maintaining her place in the succession and not appearing threatening enough to provoke Mary's wrath. She succeeded barely. Mary imprisoned her in the Tower of London for several months, suspecting her of involvement in Protestant plots. But she couldn't prove anything, and eventually released Elizabeth to house arrest. If John Neville, living as Elizabeth, felt the irony of being imprisoned in the same tower where the real Elizabeth's mother had been executed, he never showed it. He played the part of frightened, innocent princess perfectly. Mary ruled for 5 years, and they were 5 years of religious violence and political instability. She tried to reverse the Protestant reforms that had taken hold in England, burning heretics and forcing the country back toward Catholicism. She made herself so unpopular that by the time she died in 1558, most of England was relieved. And that's when the village boy who had become Elizabeth Tudor finally reached the throne. In November 1558, Mary I died childless, and Elizabeth became Elizabeth I. The deception that had started in a moment of panic in Bisley, that was supposed to be temporary, that had somehow survived 14 years, now placed its subject in the most powerful position in England. The boy who should have died of old age as a village farmer was now Queen of England. And the real Elizabeth Tudor, dead at 10, lay in an unmarked grave in Gloucestershire, her true identity lost forever. But becoming queen meant the deception became infinitely harder to maintain. As a princess, Elizabeth could stay relatively private, could limit who had access to her, could control her environment carefully. As queen, she was the center of attention. Foreign ambassadors watched her constantly. Her counselors saw her regularly. The entire court revolved around her presence. And this is where the evidence that supports the Bisley Boy theory becomes impossible to ignore. Because the person who ruled as Elizabeth I displayed characteristics that confused contemporary observers and continue to puzzle historians. She was unusually tall for a woman of her era, standing above many of the men at her court. She had a notably deep voice that multiple ambassadors commented on independently. She moved with what observers called masculine bearing, or a soldier's stride, rather than the graceful glide expected of noblewomen. These weren't criticisms designed to insult her. They were confused observations from trained diplomats who spent their careers studying royalty and couldn't make sense of what they were seeing. They expected to see a typical royal woman, and what they saw instead was someone who didn't quite fit the category. The most damning piece of evidence comes from the Spanish ambassador, who wrote exactly 7 words that ended his diplomatic career. Her Majesty's form is not as other women's. He was recalled to Madrid immediately after that dispatch arrived, pulled out of England before he could explain what he meant, before he could provide details about what exactly he'd observed. The Spanish archives buried his report among thousands of others where it sat undiscovered for centuries. But those 7 words hint at something deeply significant. A trained observer, someone whose entire job was studying foreign royalty and reporting accurately on what he saw, noticed something fundamentally different about Elizabeth's physical form. Something unusual enough that he felt compelled to report it, despite the diplomatic danger. Something that didn't match his extensive experience with royal women across Europe. If John Neville from Bisley had taken Elizabeth's place, this is exactly the kind of observation we'd expect. A boy's body, no matter how carefully disguised, would have characteristics that trained observers might notice. Height, build, voice, movement patterns, all the subtle physical differences that become more pronounced after puberty, and that would be impossible to completely hide. And then there's Elizabeth's absolute refusal to marry. This was the greatest mystery of her reign, the question that confused everyone from her closest counselors to foreign kings. She was the most eligible woman in Europe, pursued relentlessly by suitors from every major power. The political pressure to marry was enormous and constant. Her counselors begged her. Parliament formally petitioned her. Foreign ambassadors came specifically to arrange marriages, and Elizabeth always said no. She made excuses. She delayed. She claimed the timing wasn't right. She dangled the possibility of marriage for decades without ever committing. Historians have proposed countless explanations. Psychological trauma from her father's marriages, political calculation, desire for independence. But what if the truth was simpler? What if Elizabeth couldn't marry because any husband would discover on the wedding night that something was fundamentally wrong? If John Neville from Bisley was living as Elizabeth, marriage would mean immediate discovery. A husband would know instantly that his bride was not what she appeared to be. The deception that had survived for decades would collapse in a single night. I hope you found this deep dive into one of history's most disturbing royal conspiracies as fascinating as we did researching it. If you want more shocking historical secrets that your teachers never told you, hit that subscribe button right now because we're uncovering the truth behind centuries of lies and cover-ups. Smash the like button if you think it's time for modern historians to finally investigate this theory seriously, using DNA testing and ground-penetrating radar at Bisley. And drop your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe the Bisley Boy theory? Was Elizabeth I actually a village boy who fooled all of England? Or is there another explanation for all these strange coincidences? Your comments help us decide which historical mysteries to investigate next. So let us know what you want to hear about.